The Starside Prophecy by Tirri. Read by the author. Chapter 21. Rebecca, daughter of Jim and Joan. It was a rainy night just after 9 when my mother entered my room. She closed the door silently, a habit we had all mastered. I could tell she was tense. She paced up and down tiger-like with her hands folded behind her back. She seemed to be setting the stage for something. Something was obviously very wrong, but I just remained still and watched. I wasn't expecting my mother to whirl around so quickly, and I wasn't expecting her expression to be so venomous. Her eyes were wide, as if it was essential that her expression mirror her state of mind. She looked like an untamed, even predatory animal, but still she did not make a sound. Everything in the house had to be done silently, including whatever this was. My mother's eyes met mine and she hissed the words, "You have to go." She then silently left the room, but what lingered for days afterwards was her steely determination. I was shocked, but shouldn't have been. Roy was constantly complaining about my brother and I. The way we dressed, the way we ate our food, the way we spoke, our vocabulary, our diction. He found everything about us subpar. Recently he had been more critical than usual. It appeared that maintaining his vow to tolerate his stepchildren was becoming difficult to honour. I phoned my dad the following evening from a telephone box down the road to ask him if I could come and live with him. I didn't expect much from him because I had learned not to, but he was sympathetic when I told him what had been going on, and he told me that Mark and I could come and live with him, but not until his divorce. He was still living in the back bedroom of a house he shared with his soon-to-be ex-wife, and they were fighting nightly. I hung up the phone and focused on the coming weekend. My dad had promised to visit, but promising to visit didn't actually mean that he would. Things came up often. Work trouble, car trouble, which really meant hangover trouble. We were told whatever excuse had the best chance of placating us. My mum had not spoken to me since her visit, and when I told her I couldn't live with Dad until he divorced, she bristled, but didn't say anything more because she could hear Roy's timely footsteps. My dad rolled into town the following Friday evening in his big new silver Citroën Palace. I was very happy to see him, and so was my brother. We would be out of the house for the entire weekend, and who the fuck cared what my mother and Roy did? I didn't. I didn't even know who my mother was anymore, and all I knew about Roy was that he was very unwell. My father always stayed at the Otter Inn, a bed and breakfast. There were enough bedrooms that my brother and I were welcome to stay every time. Freddie the poodle always slept with me. My dad and Steve the owner were always delighted to see each other, and they spent a lot of time reminiscing about the good old days in the 60s when they were boys about town in London's West End. After the bar closed, they played cribbage into the early hours. My dad would drink steadily all night. Steve never tried to keep up. My brother and I were free to order whatever we wanted from the dinner menu, usually steak and chips with cheesecake to follow. It was a busy evening, but we were all sitting comfortably at our favourite table in the bar area. My dad was in a good mood, which was normal. He had been drinking a lot, which was normal too. I didn't care, as long as he was happy. However he got there was fine by me. As we were finishing dessert, a lady walked into the pub, followed by her husband. She was short, overweight, and had a lovely smile. She introduced herself as Rebecca, but said to call her Becky. Becky then introduced us to her husband, John. Becky sat on the vacant bar stool nearest our table. I laughed inwardly because her short little legs were dangling. John didn't say much, and I felt like it was because he never said much. John apparently liked to gamble peacefully by himself. He spent the rest of the evening feeding money into the slot machine on the other side of the pub without getting much of it back. Becky told us that she had just moved to town and the Otter Inn was now her local. She told us she groomed and exercised horses for a living in exchange for a small cottage on the grounds owned by the family who had recently employed her. She and my dad hit it off instantly, and after Becky ordered her whiskey and ginger, she and my dad started talking about which whiskey they preferred, Glenmorangie, Glenfiddich or some other Glen. It was now 8 p.m. and my brother had gone back up to the room to watch the A-Team. I stayed in the bar with my dad and perked up when the conversation changed direction. I listened to my dad telling Becky about the state of affairs with my mother and Roy. Becky listened intently but didn't interject. My dad told her about the captain and the annulment, Roy the locksmith, Roy the pianist, Roy the maniac, and all the other hats he aimlessly wore. The finale to the story was the part when my mum had come into my room the previous week. Becky's expression was somewhere between incredulous and forlorn. I realised that it was because it all must have sounded so bizarre and so depressing. After knocking back her drink and ordering another, Becky turned to my dad and said with a smile, "Well, that's it then. Sarah must come and live with me." My dad smiled and shook Becky's hand warmly. This was a very touching moment because this handshake was obviously heartfelt by them both. Apparently, Becky's offer was not perceived by either of them as throwaway. Arrangements about my immediate future were made and discussed that night. I would have my own room and ride my bike to school, and Becky said I could collect eggs from the chicken coop if I liked chickens. I made her laugh because I said I liked chickens but not eggs. The atmosphere was celebratory, and my dad bought a round of drinks for everyone in the pub because he was very happy that a problem had been solved and the solution to it had not impacted his life in any way. I didn't really know how to respond to this new and surprising development. I was intrigued about the possibility of my life being more agreeable, but I didn't know anything about the stranger who had so graciously volunteered to be my mum. I felt very insecure. I thought about my brother and how my leaving the house might affect him, but I was also jealous. He was the chosen one and I was not. My mother had favoured my brother because he had done a better job at remaining invisible than I had. But what could have been the seeds of bitterness died before they had a chance to sprout. I knew that none of what was happening to me was my brother's fault. The following week I moved in with Becky and John. My mother drove me there as if I was just being dropped off at a friend's house for a sleepover. She and Becky had talked over the phone, but only once, and had not met in person. And when we arrived, my mother's opening remark was that she couldn't stay long because Roy was taking her to lunch. I wondered what Becky was thinking, and I wondered whether she wondered what I was thinking. I wondered what my mum was thinking, and then I no longer needed to wonder. Her thoughts were out in the open. "You have a very pretty cottage here," she said, smiling at Becky. My mum sat perched on the chair nearest the door. Becky was sitting next to me with a cat on her lap. The cat's name was Pee-Pee, and I wondered what its initials stood for. "The sweet peas growing up the trellis are lovely," chimed in my mother again. The shallowness of her comment, along with her brisk joviality, was in such bad taste that I had to clamp my lips shut to stop from screaming. My mother made a dash to leave after 15 minutes, and I followed her to her car. I was surprised she hadn't left the engine running. Becky allowed us time to say goodbye privately, but it wouldn't have mattered if the whole world had been watching. Our goodbye was devoid of any substance. I watched my mum's car drive away and waited motionless for the noise of the engine to fade completely. I had felt a lot of very intense emotions during the time I had been alive, but being discarded by the one person who wasn't supposed to do that was by far the most difficult to deal with. At 14 years old, I was abandoned by my mum and rescued by a stranger. I wasn't able to cry, not that it would have helped me find relief. I was too numb. The pain I felt inside must have found deep trenches of soft tissue to reside in. McIseldeck stood before the eye and smiled. Sarah was exactly where she needed to be, fully unconscious of the fact that she was walking her destiny. There were no traces of optimism that things might get better. She was zombie-like and closed off. All she wanted to do was sleep. Countless souls were in a similar boat, blind to the bigger picture by deliberate amnesia, until it was time for them to awaken. The story of Sarah's ascent from seaweed to sovereignty was nearing the end, and sometimes the last stages were taxing, like a chick desperately trying to get out of the shell that no longer served a purpose. Since she was a young child, Sarah had involuntarily glimpsed what the fourth stage of human evolution could look like, an entirely spiritual experience, but she had not yet understood how to consciously re-attain divine awareness. "Good," said Melchizedek to himself. "All is on course."